Thank you. I want to thank Doug Parks for providing this opportunity for me to speak here before you, and I want to thank you for coming out because I have some very, very exciting information that I love to share with everybody, and this information really relates to what controls biology. And as Doug mentioned, I was a cellular biologist at the University of Wisconsin cloning human muscle cells. I was taking cells out of people, putting them into the tissue culture dish, and studying individual cells in an effort to understand what was controlling their fate, what was making them dystrophic or pathological, what was making them normal, and in the control process. In this research, I started to come to an understanding that greatly differed from my whole scientific foundation, that we were controlled by genes. And in the end, the research let me in on the inside that it was the perception of the environment that controlled the cell. Well, at cell levels, perceptions are perceptions, but at human levels, perceptions are beliefs. And it turns out that it's actually our beliefs that select our genes and select our behavior. And the beautiful part about this, as Doug said, is it's life-changing for myself especially. I was one of the genetic kind of people, and now I've transitioned my whole life into this so-called New Age spiritual science of belief. And the wonderful part about this lecture, outside of the fact that I will provide you with a molecular connection of how a belief actually switches on a gene so that there's no like empty boxes, no devotion in this place. This is actually just molecules. I'm going to get that across, I hope. But the beautiful part about this is that in the second part of the presentation, a dear friend and colleague of mine, Rob Williams, is going to provide you with information and tools about how you can rapidly change beliefs. Belief changing is not that hard a process. In fact, it can be done almost in minutes. So there's new science and new tools available. But before I start, let's start off with a truth statement. This is a very simple truth statement. Knowledge is power. The more awareness you have, the more capable you are of surviving and succeeding. Well, this is a truth, but there's another truth as well that goes with this picture, and that is lack of knowledge results in a lack of power. Why is this relevant right now? This question about lack of knowledge is this. Is that we all have been provided with information about our health being involved with our genes. We used to hear the stories, actually we still hear it on a daily newspaper. You might even find an article tonight that talks about the fact that the genes control the aspects of our lives. Well, we also recognize this, that we got the genes from our parents. And when you get genes from your parents and all of a sudden the genes control your life, then you find yourself to be more or less a victim of your heredity. If you find that there's cancer running in your family, then what do you start to get nervous about? My God, I've got genes in here. I'm a ticking time bomb. Something is going to go off and I'm going to end up dead, or some problem is going to happen. Why? Not my responsibility. Came from my parents. Well, the problem with that belief system is it extends to another level. It says if you really can't do anything about your genes because that's what you receive from your parents, then all of a sudden you become irresponsible in the sense of like, well, I can't do anything about it, so why should I even try? And that's when all of a sudden all things go lost. And this is where this lack of power manifests itself, because this belief about genes is totally disempowering to every one of us, because it says you are less powerful than your genes. But what about the reality that this is not a true statement? And the fact is, well, let me explain what I'm talking about here. I'll start off with this. This picture of the DNA, almost everyone has seen this. It's been in school for so many years now. We're all trained with this. We see this on the media every day, that the DNA in your body, the genes in your body provide for the characteristics of your life. So things not just besides your height, your hair color, your eye color, but things like anxiety and obesity and homosexuality and aggression and shyness and happiness are all characteristics that have been attributed to genes. And if this is true, then the belief system, of course, is that when you got these genes at the moment of fertilization, your life was already established, and all the rest of your life is just the unfoldment of the programs that you received from your parents. So the genes, and we're going to talk some science tonight, but it's not going to be that difficult, so bear with me on it, because again, I don't want to leave black boxes in here, empty spaces where you have to have devotion. I'm going to show you the connection. The genes, the DNA molecules, are found in the cell, in the individual cell, in a structure called the nucleus. So almost all people have seen a cell with a nucleus in it. And virtually all the genes are in the nucleus. As it says right here in this paper, which is in a recent issue of Science, this is one of the most prestigious journals in the world today, it says here in the first sentence on this article, which was dealing with the whole issue dedicated to the role of the nucleus, first sentence, the nucleus is the command center of the cell. This is conventional belief, that the nucleus is the command center because in the nucleus are the genes, and the genes control you, so the nucleus represents that source of control for the cell. Well, the command center of the cell would be tantamount to the brain. As I used to teach in medical school to the medical students, the cells, and this is an image of a cell, just a cartoon image of a cell. The cells make us up. We have approximately 50 to 75 trillion cells that make our body. Interesting point I used to teach them is this. There is no new function in your entire human body that's not already present in every cell. Every cell has a respiratory system, a digestive system, an excretory system, an endocrine system, an integumentary system, a nervous system, a reproductive system, an immune system. Basically, what I'm trying to tell you is this, that the cell and the human are structural functional counterparts of each other. Whatever is in the cell is in the human. Whatever is in the human is in the cell. So when I talk about the brain of the cell, or the brain of the human, as that element that controls the command center of the human body, when I come over here and just read what we just read off the Science journal that said the nucleus is the command center of the cell, this is because all the DNA is in here, then we get the assumption that the nucleus is the brain of the cell, which is what you anticipate if it's the command center. Well, that's an interesting concept for this reason. I'll ask you a simple question, and the question is this. If I take the brain out of any living organism, what is the immediate and necessary consequence of that action? Death. Absolutely, it's going to die. So what happens if I go to the cell and take the nucleus out of the cell? Well, if the nucleus is the brain of the cell, by definition, the cell is going to die. Here's the reality. I remove the brain from any organism and the organism dies. But if I go to the nucleus and remove the nucleus from the cell is totally unaffected by it. A cell can live for 2 or more months with no genes in it at all. And it's not just sitting there. It's doing everything it was doing before we took the nucleus out. It's moving around. It's communicating with other cells. It's eating. It's growing. It's able to eliminate waste and build up its structure. It recognizes toxins and moves away from them. Recognizes food, moves toward that. Basically, what am I telling you? I take all the genes out of the cell and I alter the behavior in no way. Meaning this, by definition, the nucleus cannot be the controlling center of the cell because the cell still has control with no nucleus. Well, wait, I took all the genes out and the cell still has behavior. The bottom line is that the genes do not control biology. This is a mistake. This is an assumption. It was made years and years ago. It was never proven scientifically, but it just seemed so correct that we bought the story. And in fact, the cosmic joke just hit us not very long ago with the outcome of the Human Genome Project. Why was it a joke? And I'll tell you this. If the mechanism worked according to the way it's written in the textbooks, that the genes control biology, then there's the requirement that there has to be at least 120,000 genes to make a human. When the Human Genome Project's results were turned in, it turned out that there were only less than 35,000 genes. Over 90,000 genes are not present, which means this. It's not that the genes are absent. Our belief system was wrong. The genes do not control biology like we thought. So the Human Genome Project really pulls the rug out because they thought they were going to get the blueprint of how to make a human with all of these genes. And it turns out there are not that many genes. 2/3 of the genes are missing. Meaning we have to now understand a new way of looking at biology. Interestingly enough, though, the new understanding actually started to come out in the last 10 years. So everything I'm going to talk to you about tonight is science within the last 10 years. And the interesting part about it is this. It takes at least 10 or 15 years for science to take a fact from its first inception to get it out into the public so that the people can understand it. So anything in a textbook, for example, is at least 10 or 15 years old. So what you're going to hear tonight is the future textbook. You're going to know the science that has just been released in the last 10 years. And I'm going to talk about this amazing structure, the human cell, and how it works. And I also told you that the cell and you have the same functions. Where you have an organ in your body, the cell has organelles that carry out the same function. So that this is a respiratory and digestive system. These are all structures in the cell. And the issue is, what we really want to find out is, where's the brain of the cell? Because up to just a few minutes ago, the conventional belief is the brain of the cell are the genes. But if I take all the genes out and the brain is still functioning, we have to look for an alternative understanding of how the cell works. So I'm going to start off and give you some very basic insight into the mechanism of how cells work, okay? And cells are very interesting. They're like machines. This is an example of a transmission out of my car. And what you can see, it's called an exploded diagram, because you can see all these intricate little parts that all come together and assemble together to make a functional car transmission. Well, the point about it is this. The cell is analogous to this for the following reason. The cell is actually a machine made out of parts, but the parts are proteins, not metal parts and gears like this. The cells are made out of protein parts. There's approximately 70,000 protein parts. So when you open up a cell and you start to take it out, you can start to find that the building blocks are proteins. This becomes very important, because what I want you to understand is, when you look in the mirror and see yourself, when you say, brown hair, blue eyes, such a height, all of that is due to the protein. The protein provides you with your structure. And so the assembly of these parts. And the interesting thing about these machine parts is this. I can do a lot of the functions in a test tube. I can do digestion in a test tube. All I have to do is take the right enzymes, the proteins for digestion, put it in a test tube, it'll do digestion. I can do muscle contraction. I can take the actin and myosin, which are the contractile proteins, put them in a test tube and make them contract in front of your eyes. I can do respiration in a test tube. What I'm saying again, the cell is a machine. It's made out of parts. The parts interact with each other to create the complex thing we call life. Well, let's talk about the parts. As I said, there were 70 to 90,000 different protein parts that make up the human. Now, here's the interesting understanding about these parts. Of all the proteins, all of them are linear strings, just like this beaded string. Every protein is a beaded string. The beads are the subunits. The little beads are called amino acids. So when you go to the health food store and you're talking about buying amino acids, what are you buying? You're buying the little building blocks to make the protein. So what makes the difference between 70 to 90,000 different proteins? And the answer is this. First, they're all strings, as I said, so that's already a commonality. What's the difference? Two things. The length of the chain, how many amino acids are in the string, is variable from one protein to the next. And number two, and most importantly, the sequence of the colors which represent the different amino acids are making the characteristic of the protein. Now, it's hard for you to see how you get structure out of something that looks like a string of beads. So instead of beads, I'm going to use these as representatives of beads. These are little pipe fittings. I have three different, actually, shapes of pipe fittings. A 45-degree angle pipe fitting, a 90-degree angle pipe fitting, and a straight one. So three variations, and consider there are 20 different variations. I'm only showing you three. So here's the point. If I start to assemble these pipe fittings in a sequence, what you can start to see is I am creating a linear chain, but now it's not so flexible and floppy. It actually has a rigid backbone kind of structure to it. So as I start to assemble this, you can see I can create a structure, okay? But here's what I told you. What did I tell you about what was making the difference between the proteins? The sequence and the length of the chain. So look, what if I take this apart and reassemble the sequence of amino acids in a different sequence? You think I'm going to get the same shape? So let's take it apart and we'll take a look at it and see what happens. So the point about it is this. You assemble the amino acids, you put them in a sequence, and the sequence determines what's going to happen. So I take the same amino acids, plug them in now in a sequence, but a different sequence than just we had a second ago. And as I do this, you can see the shape of this protein is not the same as it was the first time. Is that evident? Is that, can you see that? I want everybody to understand it. Why is this important? What's the point? The parts of the proteins have structure due to the sequence of these amino acids, okay? Number two, how can I get 70,000 different parts? And the answer is this. By creating a chain with a different sequence of amino acids for each different protein. So you saw that, right? So now the bottom line is this. I have this particular protein. And if I just made a body out of protein only, and that's all it was, then I would be a statue. Instead of made out of brass or bronze, I'd be a statue made out of organic building blocks called a protein. There's no life. Where does the life come from? That is the most important, exciting question. I made a machine out of protein, but what is life? Life is animation. Life is movement. And so therefore, where's the movement come from? Now I'm going to show you that. And it's simple, because this is the ultimate understanding of where life comes from. When I assembled these together, I connected them like poppet beads, but look, they twist. Because at the junction, they're not locked, so I can change the shape of this protein. I just made this one. Okay? Now I'm going to show you something. Let me show you two different shapes. And before I do that, I'm going to give you a little piece of information. The yellow ones at the end are going to be negatively charged. Both of them are negative. Why is this important? We'll go back to a very basic principle of science. When two like charges come against each other, what do? They repel each other. And two opposite charges, what do? Attract. So I'm going to show you two different shapes of the same protein by just twisting it. And I'm going to ask you to tell me which is the more stable of the two. Okay? Let's use this as shape 1. Okay? Now I'm going to show you shape 2, and then I want you to tell me which is more stable, shape 1 or shape 2? Shape 2. And the reason why? Because the two negative charges repel each other. They want to get as far away from each other as they can. So does this make sense that this is a stable shape for this protein? Okay, cool. Now, I have this protein in your body, and I said that this was negative at the end. And this is an environmental signal, and I'm going to talk about environmental signals. Signals are either other molecules or atoms or energy. Energy can be signals as well. But in this case, let's say it's a molecule. Let's say it's estrogen, a hormone. And let's just say that it's very positively charged. What's the charge on here? Negative. A negative? Okay, so if this is coming along and this is positive, what happens when two opposite charges come near each other? So all of a sudden you're going to find that there's a binding. This is where the estrogen binds to the protein. Now this is more positive than this negative. So the question is this. What's the charge at this end of the molecule now? Positive. What's the charge at this one? Now the question is very simple. Is this shape of the molecule stable, or is this one more stable? Now this is so fundamental. I want you to understand how critical this is. You understood that there was a shape, that if I have this molecule on, let's say I take this molecule off, what's the shape going to do? It's going to open back up like this, right? And then if I put the molecule back on, what's the shape going to do? Close. Well, you just told me there were two shapes that were stable, and the difference is when I add this signal, I go from one shape to the other. Does that make sense? Well, that is where life comes from. Life is movement of the proteins. The proteins move, and when they change shape, they can do jobs. So if I have work, I can have this thing do a job. By opening and closing, that would be its job. So you can say, well, what kind of jobs are just like simple movements? I'll give you a simple one. Let's say I'm a protein, and that this is the signal molecule, and I stand like this, and when the signal molecule hits in my hand, I go like that, and I let go of the signal. What happens if I let go of the signal? What's going to happen? I'm going to go back. And then another signal comes in my hand. Then what am I going to do? Go like this. And you say, well, that's a nice simple movement, but what does that have to do with it? Well, if your house is on fire and you have a bucket brigade and I'm a protein in the middle and somebody hands me the bucket, what am I going to do? Pick it from here and pass it to the other guy. Well, the point about it is very simply this. Proteins provide for my physical structure, but proteins can change shape when a signal binds to that protein. So all of a sudden it says that a static protein could just be sitting here, but the moment the signal shows up, the protein does something. Well, that something is hooked or actually used to do a job in the cell. So what is digestion? Here's an enzyme. It stands here. Here's the food molecule, and it gets caught in my hand, and I bring it together, and I rip it apart. That's all it is, ripping apart, digestion. So the bottom line is this. You're a machine. The structure of the machine is due to the protein parts. The proteins are all these linear chains made out of amino acids. That the final structure is due to the sequence of the amino acids and the charge. That's this critical part. When I balance the charge, the protein is stable. If I change the charge, the protein changes its shape. It's simple, but it's very basic science. Okay. tradition, studying individual cells in an effort to understand what was controlling their fate, what was making them dystrophic or pathological, what was making them normal, and in the control process. In this research, I started to come to an understanding that greatly differed from my whole scientific foundation, that we were controlled by genes. And in the end, the research let me in on the insight that it was the perception of the environment that controlled the cell. Well, at cell levels, perceptions are perceptions, but at human levels, perceptions are beliefs. And it turns out that it's actually our beliefs that select our genes and select our behavior. And the beautiful part about this, as Doug said, is it's life-changing for myself especially. I was one of the genetic kind of people, and now I've transitioned my whole life into this so-called New Age spiritual science of belief. And the wonderful part about this lecture, outside of the fact that I will provide you with a molecular connection of how a belief actually switches on a gene so that there's no like empty boxes, no devotion in this place. This is actually just molecules. I'm going to get that across, I hope. But the beautiful part about this is that in the second part of the presentation, a dear friend and colleague of mine, Rob Williams, is going to provide you with information and tools about how you can rapidly... Thank you. I want to thank Doug Parks for providing this opportunity for me to speak here before you, and I want to thank you for coming out, because I have some very, very exciting information that I love to share with everybody. And this information really relates to what controls biology. And as Doug mentioned, I was a cellular biologist at the University of Wisconsin, cloning human muscle cells. I was taking cells out of people, putting them into the tissue